morning sun hit the glass storefront of the Gilded Edge with a sharpness that matched Elena's mood. She adjusted her silk scarf, her eyes scanning the street for her driver, though she knew he wouldn't be back for another hour. Elena lived her life by a clock that everyone else was expected to follow. To her, time was the only currency that mattered, and she hated feeling like anyone was wasting hers. She stepped inside the boutique, the bell above the door giving a polite, expensive chime. This was her sanctuary, a place where the price tags acted as a filter, keeping out the noise of the ordinary world. Elena was an interior designer for the city's elite, a woman who could tell the difference between ivory and eggshell from 20 paces. She prided herself on her eye, but that eye was often blinded by her own reflection. Clara knew Elena's reputation. She knew that a coffee bean out of place or a slightly wrinkled display could lead to a phone call to the owner. "The gala's in 3 days, Clara," Elena said, not bothering with a greeting. "I need something that says I am in charge of the room without having to speak." Last time, the lace was underwhelming. As Elena began to flip through a rack of bespoke gowns, the door chimed again. In walked an elderly woman. She was small, her back slightly curved by the weight of years, wearing a floral duster coat that had seen better days and thick, sensible shoes. Her skin was a deep, beautiful mahogany, etched with lines that told 1,000 stories, and her hair was tucked neatly under a knitted hat. She moved slowly, her hand trailing along the polished wood of the displays as if she were feeling the heartbeat of the building. Elena stopped mid-motion. This was a private showing hour, or so she had thought. She watched the woman move toward a display of silk scarves, the same scarves Elena used to accent her high-end projects. "Can I help you, ma'am?" Clara asked, her voice hovering between professional kindness and the fear of Elena's judgment. The old woman, whose name was Beatrice, looked up and smiled. It was a slow, warm smile that reached her eyes. "Oh, I'm just looking. Sugar. My grandson told me this place had the finest fabrics in the city. He's graduating soon, and I wanted to see something special." Elena let out a short, sharp sigh, loud enough to be heard across the room. She turned toward them, her heels clicking like a countdown on the marble floor. "Clara, really?" Elena said, her voice dripping with a calculated coldness. "I thought this was a professional establishment. Some people are here to actually make a purchase, not just to touch things." Beatrice turned her gaze toward Elena. She didn't look offended. She looked curious, as if she were examining a strange specimen. "It's a beautiful shop, miss. No harm in appreciating beauty, is there?" "There is when that beauty is delicate," Elena snapped. She stepped closer, her perfume filling the space between them like a wall. "These fabrics cost more than most people's monthly rent. They aren't meant for hands that... Well, let's be honest. You're clearly in the wrong place. There's a thrift shop 3 blocks down that might be more your speed." The air in the boutique turned heavy. Clara looked down at the counter, her face flushing red. She wanted to say something, but the power dynamic in the room was a jagged cliff. Elena held all the rope. Beatrice didn't flinch. She adjusted her small, worn handbag. "I've lived in this city for 80 years, she said softly. "I've seen a lot of things change. I've seen buildings go up and come down. But I've noticed that some people grow meaner as they grow richer. It's a heavy burden to carry, being that angry all the time." Lena felt a flush of heat rise to her neck. "I am not angry. I am a client. And as a client, I expect an environment that reflects the status I pay for. You are a distraction. Now, if you don't mind, some of us have lives to lead." Elena turned her back, dismissed the woman, as if she were a smudge on a window. She began talking loudly to Clara about the thread count of a nearby pashmina, deliberately ignoring the elderly woman standing just a few feet away. Beatrice stood still for a moment. She looked at the back of Elena's perfectly styled hair, a shadow of sadness passing over her face. She didn't argue. She didn't shout. She simply turned and began the slow walk back toward the door, as she pulled a tissue from her pocket to pat her brow. A small, dull silver object slipped out with it. It hit the thick carpet with a silent thud, landing right near the base of the mannequin Elena was inspecting. Beatrice, her hearing not what it used to be, didn't notice. The bell chimed, the door closed, and the distraction was gone. Finally, Elena muttered, reaching for a blue gown. Now, where were we? She stepped forward to get a better look at the hem, and her toe caught on something hard. She looked down, expecting a stray pin. Instead, she saw a vintage locket. It was tarnished, the silver rubbed thin in places, held together by a fragile-looking chain. She dropped her junk, Elena said, picking it up with 2 fingers as if it were a piece of trash. See what I mean, Clara? Now I have to deal with this. She was about to toss it onto the counter for Clara to deal with, but the latch was loose. As the locket dangled from her hand, it swung open. Elena's heart didn't just skip a beat. It seemed to stop entirely. Inside the locket was a tiny hand-cut photograph. It was a man, young and handsome, with a very specific sharp jawline and a small mole just above his left eyebrow. It was a face Elena knew intimately. It was the face of her grandfather, the man who had built the Vance family fortune, the man whose portrait hung in the center of her mother's mansion. But in this photo, he wasn't wearing a tuxedo. He was in a simple work shirt, his arm draped comfortably around the shoulder of a young black woman who looked exactly like a younger version of the woman Elena had just chased out of the store, the boutique. With all its expensive lighting and silent luxury, suddenly felt like it was spinning. Elena gripped the counter, the cold silver of the locket biting into her palm. The woman she had just called trash wasn't just a stranger. She was holding a piece of Elena's own bloodline. The drive home was a blur of gray buildings and flashing brake lights. Elena sat in the back of her car, the silver locket pressed so hard into her palm that she could feel the sharp edges of the metal. She didn't look out the window. She didn't check her phone for work emails. For the first time in years, the important world of interior design felt like a stage set made of cardboard. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that tiny photograph. The man in the picture was undeniably her grandfather, Arthur. But the way he was smiling, a genuine, open-hearted grin, was something she had never seen in the stiff, formal oil paintings that decorated their family estate. When she reached her apartment, a glass-walled fortress overlooking the park, the silence felt deafening. She set the locket on her marble kitchen island. Against the expensive cold stone, the tarnished silver looked like an intruder. Elena poured herself a glass of water, her hands shaking. She kept telling herself there had to be an explanation. Maybe he had been a kind employer. Maybe it was a photo of a friend. But her gut knew better. The intimacy in the photo, the way their heads leaned together, spoke of a life that hadn't been written in the family history books. She knew there was only one person who held the keys to the past, her mother. Lillian. Lillian lived in a high-end assisted living facility on the edge of the city. It was a place for people who wanted to age with dignity, which in their world meant surrounded by silk wallpaper and nurses who spoke in whispers. Elena arrived there as the sun was beginning to set. The lobby smelled like lilies and floor wax. She found her mother in the sunroom. Lillian was a woman who had spent her entire life maintaining a certain image. Her hair was perfectly coiffed, even on a Tuesday afternoon, and her pearls were always in place. "Elena, dear," Lillian said, not turning around. "You missed our lunch date yesterday. I assumed you were too busy making someone's living room look like a museum." Elena didn't apologize. She walked over and stood in front of her mother. "I found something today, Mother." At a boutique downtown, Lillian finally looked up, her eyes narrowing. A sale or a scandal? Elena reached into her bag and pulled out the locket. She opened it and held it out. The change in Lillian was instantaneous. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. The older woman's face didn't just turn pale. It turned a ghostly, translucent gray. Her hand went to her throat, her fingers fumbling with her own necklace. "Where did you get that?" Lillian whispered. Her voice, usually so steady and sharp, was suddenly thin and brittle. "An old woman dropped it," Elena said, her voice rising with a mix of anger and confusion. "I treated her horribly, Mother. I looked at her like she was nothing. And then I found this. Why does Grandfather have his arm around a woman who looks exactly like her? Why is this photo hidden in a piece of jewelry that looks like it's been loved for 50 years? Lillian turned away. her gaze fixed on the darkening garden. For a long time she didn't speak. The only sound was the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway. "Your grandfather was a man of his time, Alina," Lillian finally said. Though she sounded like she was reciting a script she had practiced for decades. "He worked hard to build what we have. He moved here to give us a clean start. A fresh slate. A fresh slate." Alina stepped closer. "Or a lie?" "I did some digging on the way here. I looked through those old boxes you kept in the attic. There's no record of his life before he moved north. No birth certificate in the file, no photos of his parents. Just him, suddenly appearing in the city, with enough money to start a business. Where did he really come from?" Lillian's shoulders slumped. The mask of the perfect lady was cracking. He had a sister, Alina. A sister he loved very much. But the world they lived in, it didn't allow for a family like theirs to succeed. He was light-skinned enough that people didn't ask questions. He realized that if he left, if he crossed over and changed his name, he could be someone. He could own businesses. He could marry someone like me. He could ensure his children never had to struggle. Alina felt a cold chill run down her spine. So he just left her. He left his sister behind to live a lie. "He sent money," Lillian said defensively, her eyes snapping back to her daughter. "Every month for years, he took care of them from a distance. But he could never go back. And she could never come here. It was the price of our life, Alina. The life you enjoy so much. The clothes you wear, the apartment you live in, it was bought with that silence." The realization hit Alina like a physical blow. Her belief that she came from better stock, it was all built on a foundation of abandonment and shame. She thought of the woman in the boutique. The woman she had mocked for being poor. That woman wasn't just a stranger. She was the keeper of the truth. She was the one who had stayed behind while Elena's grandfather ran away to play a part. "Her name is Beatrice," Elena said, her voice trembling. "She's his niece, isn't she? Or maybe even his sister's daughter. She's my family." "She is a memory that was supposed to stay buried," Lillian snapped, though there were tears in her eyes. "Don't go digging this up, Alina. It won't bring you anything but trouble. People talk. They won't understand." Alina looked at her mother. Lee looked at her hand. Saw a woman who was terrified of a ghost. She saw the hollow shell of a life lived in fear of being found out. "I cared more about a silk scarf than a human being today. I looked at a woman who shares my blood, and I told her she didn't belong in the same room as me." Alina turned to leave, but she stopped at the door. "Grandfather didn't just leave his family. Mother, he left his soul. And it looks like he passed that emptiness down to us." She walked out of the facility and into the cool night air. Her heart was pounding, but for the first time, her mind was clear. She didn't go home to her glass apartment. Instead, she sat in her car and pulled out her laptop. She began searching through public records, school archives, and local community boards. She spent the entire night in the glow of the screen. She found Beatrice's name in a newspaper article from 10 years ago. She had been honored for 40 years of service as a history teacher. She found a photo of Beatrice standing in front of a small, colorful house in a neighborhood Alina had spent her life avoiding as the sun began to rise over the city. Turning the sky a dusty pink, Alina didn't feel tired. She felt a strange, flickering spark of something she hadn't felt in years. A purpose. She looked at the locket one more time. She knew what she had to do. She had to go back to that neighborhood. She had to find the woman she had treated like trash and hope that somehow the grace she had seen in Beatrice's eyes was strong enough to offer a second chance. The drive toward the older part of the city felt different this time. People were out on their porches. Neighbors were calling out to one another, and the smell of breakfast wafted through the air. Alina felt like a stranger in a foreign land. But as she pulled up to the address she had found, she realized she wasn't a stranger. She was a descendant coming home to a history she had been denied. She stepped out of her luxury car. her expensive heels clicking on the cracked sidewalk. She held the locket tight in her hand. She was terrified. For the first time in her life, Alina Vance wasn't the most important person in the room. She was just a girl looking for the truth. The sun was higher in the sky now, casting long shadows across the neighborhood Alina had only ever seen from the windows of a moving car. As she walked down the sidewalk, she felt every bit of her expensive silk blouse and her designer sunglasses. They felt like armor that no longer fit. She was looking for a small house with a blue porch, the address she had found in the archives. Every step she took away from her luxury car felt like a step toward a truth she wasn't sure she was ready to handle. She noticed things she usually ignored. She saw a group of men fixing a fence, laughing and sharing a thermos of coffee. She saw a young girl braiding her doll's hair on a stoop. There was a rhythm here, a pulse of community that felt thick and real. It made the sterile, quiet halls of her own apartment building feel like a ghost town. Alina realized that for her whole life, she had equated wealth with value. She was starting to see how wrong she had been. Finally, she saw it. The house was modest, but cared for with an intensity that made it beautiful. Flower boxes overflowed with bright yellow marigolds, and the blue paint on the porch was fresh. It was the kind of home that looked like it had been the site of 1,000 Sunday dinners. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. She reached the bottom step and stopped. She wanted to turn back. She wanted to return to her world where she was always right and always in control. But then she felt the weight of the locket in her pocket. She thought about the man in the photo, her grandfather, the sister he had erased from his life just so he could be successful. She climbed the stairs. Her hand trembled as she knocked on the door. A few moments passed, and then the door opened. There she was, Beatrice. She wasn't wearing the floral duster coat today. She wore a simple apron over a house dress, and the smell of cinnamon and baked bread drifted out from behind her. She looked at Alina, and for a second, there was no recognition. Then, the older woman's eyes sharpened. She remembered the boutique. She remembered the insults. "You're a long way from the high-end shops," Miss Beatrice said. Her voice wasn't angry. It was just tired. "If you're here to tell me I've dropped something else, I don't have much left to lose." Alina felt a lump form in her throat. The arrogance she had carried for 30 years simply evaporated. "I'm not here to insult you," Alina whispered. "I'm here because... ... Because of this." She reached into her pocket and held out the silver locket. Beatrice's breath hitched. Her hand reached out, her fingers brushing against Elena's as she took the jewelry. She held it to her chest, her eyes closing for a brief second. "I thought it was gone forever. I went back to that shop, but the girl at the counter said you had taken it. I figured it was sitting in a trash can somewhere." "So sorry," Alina said, the words spilling out of her. "I'm sorry for what I said in that shop. I was a monster. I didn't see you. I only saw what I wanted to see." Beatrice looked at her, really looked at her, and then she looked down at the locket. She popped the latch and stared at the photo of the young man and the young woman. "Why are you really here? People like you don't come to this part of town just to return a piece of old silver." Alina took a deep breath. The man in that photo? His name was Arthur. "He was my grandfather. But my mother told me he had no family. She told me he came from nothing. She told me he was someone else entirely." She stepped back and opened the door wider. "I suppose you'd better come in. The truth is a heavy thing to carry on a porch." The inside of the house was warm and filled with books. Beatrice led her to a small wooden table in the kitchen. She poured 2 cups of tea, moving with a grace that Alina now realized came from a lifetime of dignity, not a lifetime of money. "Arthur was my older brother," Beatrice began, her voice steady. "We called him Artie. He was the smartest boy in our town. He could draw, he could build, he could dream bigger than the sky. But back then, the sky had a ceiling for people who looked like us." She took a sip of tea, her eyes looking at something far away. Artie was light, lighter than the rest of us. He realized early on that if he changed his name, if he moved away and never looked back, he could be whatever he wanted to be. "He told me the night he left." He cried. I cried. He promised he'd come back for me, but we both knew he couldn't. To be who he wanted to be out there, I couldn't exist. Alina felt a tear track down her cheek. He left you to live a lie. He did it because he was scared. He wanted a piece of the world that was being kept from him. But the cost was losing his heart. He sent letters for a while. Then just envelopes with money. Then, eventually, the envelopes stopped coming. I figured he had either passed away or his new life had finally swallowed him whole. Alina looked around the kitchen. You kept his photo. After all that, you kept him in that locket. He was my brother, Beatrice said simply. You don't stop loving someone just because they're lost. I've spent my life teaching history, child. Do you know why? Because if you don't know where you came from, you'll never know where you're going. You'll just be drifting like a leaf in the wind, thinking you're special just because you're higher up than the others. Alina looked at her hands. They were the same shape as Beatrice's, the same long fingers, the same curve of the nail. For the first time in her life, Alina didn't feel like a Vance, the important designer. She felt like a granddaughter. She felt like a niece. I've spent my whole life being that leaf, Alina admitted. I thought I was better than everyone. I built a whole world out of being exclusive. But looking at you and looking at this house, ... I feel like I'm the one who has nothing. Beatrice smiled, and this time it was the same warm, knowing smile Alina had seen in the boutique, the one she had been too blind to appreciate. Acknowledging you're empty is the first step to filling yourself up. You have a lot of years to make up for sugar, not just to me, but to yourself. They talked for hours. Beatrice told her stories about Artie, how he used to whistle while he worked, how he loved the smell of rain on hot pavement, and how he had once saved his meager earnings for a whole year just to buy Beatrice a book of poetry. As Alina listened, the man from the stiff oil paintings died away, and a real human being took his place. She realized she didn't want to go back to her silent apartment. Beatrice, Alina said as the afternoon turned into evening. I know I can't undo how I treated you, and I know I can't fix what my grandfather did. But I want to know you. I want to know my family. Beatrice looked at her for a long time. The silence wasn't cold. It was weighing Alina's sincerity. Finally, the older woman nodded. The door is open, but I don't care about your money or your fancy titles. In this house, we value the heart. If you can bring that with you, then you're welcome back. Alina stood up to leave. But before she went, she did something she hadn't done in years. She reached out and hugged the older woman. Beatrice felt solid and warm, smelling of cinnamon and old books. Walking back to her car, Lena looked at the neighborhood again. It wasn't trash. It was a garden of stories, and she was lucky enough to finally be a part of it. She sat in the driver's seat and looked at her reflection in the rearview mirror. She looked the same, but the woman staring back felt like a stranger someone knew. Someone who was finally starting to see the week following Elena's visit too. Beatrice's house felt like living in two different skins. During the day, she was still the ice queen of the design world, walking through marble lobbies and nodding at people who wore watches that cost more than a family car. But at night, she sat on her floor, surrounded by old photo albums and the notes she had taken while listening to Beatrice. The more she learned about her real history, the more the world of high society felt like a theater production where everyone had forgotten their lines. The Winter Heritage Gala arrived on a Thursday. It was the biggest event of the season, a night where the city's elite gathered to celebrate their legacy. In years past, Alina had lived for this night. She loved the flashing cameras, the expensive champagne, and the feeling of being at the very top of the social ladder. But this year, as she stood in front of her mirror zipping up a black velvet dress, she didn't feel powerful. She felt like a fraud. She arrived at the museum where the gala was held. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and ego. She saw the familiar faces, property moguls, socialites, and her mother Lillian, who was holding court near a massive portrait of Elena's grandfather. The very image of a self-made titan? There she is, Lillian said, gliding over to Elena. She leaned in, her voice a sharp whisper. I hope you've put that ... business from last week behind you. This is a big night for the family. No more talk of lockets or old stories. Lena looked at her mother's polished mask and felt a wave of pity. The truth isn't business, Mother. It's who we are. Before Lillian could respond, a group of Elena's friends, the same women who had been at the boutique, approached. Among them was a woman named Claire, who was known for having a tongue sharper than a diamond. Lena, darling. Claire chirped. I heard the most ridiculous rumor. Someone said they saw your car parked in that terrible neighborhood across the river. I told them they must be mistaken. Why on earth would you be over there? Picking up some rustic inspiration from the gutter, the group laughed. In the past, Elena would have joined in. She would have made a clever, biting remark about the poverty aesthetic. But tonight, the laughter sounded like glass breaking in her ears. She thought of Beatrice's warm kitchen. She thought of the men fixing the fence and the stories of Artie's struggle. I wasn't looking for inspiration, Claire, Elena said, her voice quiet but incredibly clear. I was visiting my family. Laughter died instantly. The circle of women shifted, their faces morphing from amusement to confusion. Your family? Claire asked, a mocking smile playing on her lips. Is there a Vance cousin we don't know about? Some secret branch of the family tree living in a bungalow? Lillian stepped forward, her hand gripping Elena's arm like a vice. She's joking. Elena has a very dry sense of humor, as you all know. She's been working too hard on the museum renovation. I'm not joking, Elena said, pulling her arm away. She looked at the portrait of her grandfather. That man up there isn't who you think he is. And the people in that terrible neighborhood are more my family than anyone in this room. Elena pulled the silver locket from her clutch bag. She didn't hide it. This belongs to a woman named Beatrice. She is Arthur's sister's daughter. She is my aunt. And I treated her like she was invisible because she didn't have a dress that cost $5,000. The silence that followed was heavy. It wasn't the polite silence of a library. It was the shocked, judgmental silence of a courtroom. People from nearby tables turned to stare. The whispers began almost immediately, ripples of scandal moving through the room. Elena, stop this at once, Lillian hissed, her face turning a deep, angry red. You are destroying everything he built. No, Mother, Elena replied. I'm finally acknowledging what he built it on. He built it on a lie that required him to throw away the people who loved him most. I'm done with the lie. Claire let out a short, cold laugh. Well, this is certainly a dramatic way to commit social suicide, Elena. Do you really think anyone is going to want to work with a designer who spends her time in the slums? Your brand is about exclusivity. You've just invited the whole world into your kitchen. If my brand requires me to be a hateful person, then I don't want it, Elena said. She looked around the room at the expensive jewelry, the fake smiles, and the hollow praise. She realized she didn't care about their opinions anymore. Their judgment felt small. She turned and walked toward the exit. She didn't run. She walked with her head held high. Behind her, she could hear the roar of gossip growing louder. She knew that by tomorrow, her phone would stop ringing. Her clients would cancel their contracts. Her friends would delete her number. But as she stepped out into the night air, she felt lighter than she had in years. She didn't go to her apartment. She drove straight to the community center in Beatrice's neighborhood. She had seen it earlier, that weak, crumbling brick building that used to be a school, now struggling to stay open. Beatrice had told her it was the heart of the community. They were losing it because they couldn't afford the repairs. Elena sat in her car in the parking lot of the center. She looked at the building. It was beautiful in its bones, but it was tired. It needed a new roof, new windows, and someone who knew how to make a space feel like a home. She realized she had spent her career making. Rich people's houses look like museums, places where you were afraid to sit down. She had used her talent to build walls between people. Now, she had a chance to use it to build a bridge. The next morning, The headlines in the city's social columns were exactly what she expected. They called her the fallen socialite and mocked her meltdown at the gala. Her mother sent a legal notice saying she was being distanced from the family estate. Alina ignored it all. She sold her luxury car. She put her glass-walled apartment on the market. She took the money she had saved over the years, money she had earned from her own hard work, and she went to the community center. When she walked in, Beatrice was there, sorting through old books for a local drive. She looked up and saw Elena's face, the lack of makeup, the simple jeans, the look of a woman who had finally stopped running. "I heard about the party," Beatrice said softly. "Word travels fast, even over here." "I lost everything," Alina said, leaning against a dusty table. Beatrice walked over and put a hand on her shoulder. "No, sugar. You just cleared the clutter. You can't build anything real on a foundation of trash. Now that you've cleared the ground, you can actually start to grow." "I want to help you with this place," Alina said. "I don't just mean giving money. I want to be here. I want to design a space where the history of this neighborhood or history is told. I want to turn this into a place that can never be torn down." Beatrice looked around the drafty old room. A small, mischievous smile played on her lips. "Well, the roof leaks, and the heater sounds like a tractor. Do you think your high-end eyes can handle that?" Alina laughed, a real deep laugh that came from her stomach. "I think it's the most beautiful project I've ever seen." As they began to walk through the building, planning where the library would go and how to restore the original woodwork, Alina realized she wasn't just restoring a building. She was restoring herself. The trash she had seen before was actually gold, and the gold she had lived in was nothing but straw. She was finally home. The final months of the renovation were the hardest and most rewarding of Elena's life. Gone were the days of sipping lattes while contractors did the heavy lifting. Now, Alina was on site at 6 a.m. every morning. Her hair pulled back in a messy knot, her hands stained with paint and wood sealant. She had traded her designer heels for a pair of sturdy boots that were now caked in the dust of the old building, the community center, which she and Beatrice had renamed the Heritage House, was finally coming together. It wasn't just a renovation. It was an act of love. Alina had used her connections to find local artisans, people from the neighborhood who had been overlooked by the big firms. A man from 3 blocks down, a retired carpenter, helped her restore the grand mahogany staircase. A young woman who worked at the local library helped her curate a wall of photographs that told the true story of the town, including the faces of those who had been forced to leave to find work elsewhere. As the grand opening approached, the buzz in the city had shifted. The scandal of the gala had faded into a curious respect. People were starting to see that Alina wasn't having a breakdown. She was having a breakthrough. On the night before the opening, Alina sat on the floor of the main hall with Beatrice. The room smelled of fresh wax and hope. The light from the new street lamps filtered through the restored stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on the floor. "You look tired, child," Beatrice said, handing Alina a plastic cup of water. "I've never felt more awake," Alina replied. She looked up at the wall of truth they had created. In the center of the wall was the silver locket, mounted in a beautiful glass shadow box. Next to it was a large, high-resolution copy of the photo inside Arthur and his sister, young and full of life. "I wonder what he would think," Alina said softly, looking at the image of her grandfather. "Do you think he'd be angry that I told everyone? That I tore down the wall he built?" Beatrice was silent for a moment. She looked at the photo of her brother, her eyes misting over. "I think Artie spent 50 years looking over his shoulder, waiting for someone to find him out. I think he lived in a prison made of silk. Seeing you here, standing in the light, I think he'd finally feel like he could breathe. You didn't just tell a secret, Alina. You set a ghost free." The day of the grand opening arrived with a clear blue sky. A crowd had gathered outside the doors, families from the neighborhood, former teachers, and even a few of Elena's old associates who had come out of curiosity. To Elena's shock, she saw her mother's black town car pull up to the curb. Lillian stepped out, looking as polished as ever, but her eyes were different. She looked smaller, somehow less like a queen, and more like a woman who had realized her throne was made of sand. She walked up the steps, ignoring the cameras, and stood in front of Alina. "I didn't think you'd actually do it," Lillian said, her voice barely a whisper. "I had to, Mother. For him, for Beatrice, and for me," Alina said. Lillian looked past her daughter into the hall. Her eyes landed on the wall of truth. She walked over to it, her fingers trembling as she touched the glass of the shadow box. She stood there for a long time, looking at the father she had worshipped. The man who had taught her that image was everything. Seeing him there, in his work shirt, smiling with his sister, seemed to break something inside her. Lillian turned to Beatrice, who was standing nearby. The two women, who should have been family for decades but were kept apart by a lie, looked at each other. Lillian didn't offer a polite handshake. Instead, she let out a shaky breath and whispered, "I'm sorry. I knew. I knew, and I was too afraid to say anything." Beatrice reached out and took Lillian's hand. "Fear is a powerful thing, Lillian. But it doesn't have a home here anymore. Come inside. There's a seat for you at the table." The ceremony was simple. There were no long-winded speeches about status or legacy. Instead, Alina stood on the small stage and looked out at the faces in the room. She saw people of all ages and backgrounds. She saw the carpenter who had fixed the stairs, the kids who would now have a safe place to study, and her aunt, Beatrice, the woman who had changed her life. For a long time, "I thought that luxury was something you bought," Alina told the crowd. "I thought that being high class meant keeping people out. I was wrong. True luxury is being known. It's knowing where you come from and being proud of the hands that built your path, no matter how much dirt was under their fingernails. This house isn't mine. It belongs to the stories that were almost forgotten." As the music started and people began to tour the building, Alina felt a hand on her arm. It was Clara, the young clerk from the boutique where this had all started. "Miss Vance?" Clara said, looking nervous. "I quit the boutique last month. I saw what you were doing here on the news. I wanted to know if you need any help. I'm not an expert, but I want to do something that matters." Alina smiled, and it wasn't the cold, professional smile of the designer she used to be. It was a warm, open expression that matched the woman in the locket. "We always need help, Clara. Welcome to the team." As the evening wore on, the center became a swirl of laughter and conversation. Alina found herself in the kitchen, helping Beatrice plate food. She was covered in flour, her hair was a mess, and her back ached from standing all day. But as she looked out into the hall and saw her mother sitting with Beatrice, sharing a photo album and laughing, she realized she had finally designed the perfect room. It wasn't about the fabric or the lighting. It was about the people in it. The story of the woman who treated an old lady like trash had become the story of a woman who found her soul in the very place she once looked down upon. Alina realized that she hadn't just discovered a family, she had discovered a version of herself that she actually liked. When the last guest had left and the lights were dimmed, Alina and Beatrice stood together on the front porch. The neighborhood was quiet, the air cool and peaceful. "We did it," Alina said, leaning her head on Beatrice's shoulder. "No, sugar," Beatrice replied, looking up at the stars. "We started it. There's a lot of work left to do, and a lot more stories to tell." Alina looked down at her hands, the hands that had once been too delicate to touch anything but silk. They were calloused and tired, but they were strong. She looked at the silver locket around her own neck. Beatrice had insisted she wear it. It was no longer a piece of junk or a hidden secret. It was a compass, forever pointing her toward the truth. She wasn't the ice queen of the city anymore. She was Alina, the granddaughter of Artie, the niece of Beatrice, and a neighbor to everyone who walked through those blue doors. And as she watched the sun begin to hint at a new dawn, she knew that for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she was supposed to be.